Hi folks, my name is Dave and welcome to my video series. Hi, can I help you? Do you mind if I just take a couple minutes here? I just want people to know that if you like looking at a lot of pretty pictures and things like that, you might want to skip ahead 4 or 5 minutes because he's going to talk a lot of history, which is really cool, but some people, just like pictures. So I just want to, let people know. Okay, I gotta go. Hi folks, my name is Dave and welcome to my series on Jordan and Israel. In this video, we're going to explore the northern part of Israel and we're going to start off on the Mediterranean Sea at a place called Caesarea Maritime. Then we're going to go up to Mount Carmel, we're going to come down through the Jezreel Valley to Megiddo, and we're going to go back up north to Nazareth, the town where Jesus lived before he started his ministry. Now I know you all want to jump right into exploring these areas with me, but first we need a little history lesson about Israel. So sit up straight, get your pencils out, and no complaining. All right, let's go. The history of Israel is all about location, location, location. Israel sits between 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Today, 9 million people live in the modern state of Israel, in a space approximately the size of New Jersey, and that's without the Gaza Strip and without the West Bank, which are also known as Judea and Samaria. And in that space, 80% of the population are Jews, 19% Muslim, and 1% Christian. Israel conquered the West Bank in 1967 during the Six-Day War, and if you include the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the population balloons to nearly 16 million people. Only 3 times in all of history, and for short periods of time, have there been independent Jewish kingdoms, and I'm going to cover about 3,000 years in the next 4 minutes. Somebody time me! Alright, we'll start off with the United Kingdom under King David and King Solomon around 1000 BC. All 12 tribes of Israel were in unity, living on the same land. This is the first period of independence for Israel, but it only lasted about 70 years. After King Solomon died, there was a split. To the north was the great kingdom of Israel. To the south was the smaller kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Israel to the north was destroyed in 720 BC by the Assyrians. The kingdom of Judah survived until 586 BC, until King Zedekiah of Judah told King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, "You're not the boss of me, and I'm not going to pay your stinking taxes anymore, so there." So King Nebuchadnezzar said, "Fine, I'll just destroy you. So there." And Jerusalem and the first temple were no more after that. Alexander the Great conquered the entire world in 333 BC, and the Greek era, or Hellenistic era, began. However, the successors of Alexander the Great began fighting each other. To the north, the Syrian Seleucian. To the south, the Egyptians. And Israel became a battlefield for many, many years. The Jews rebelled against King Antiochus IV in 167 BC because he treated Israel with such violence and contempt. When he came into Jerusalem to suppress the rebellion, his troops entered the temple, forbid the regular sacrifices, set up an altar for Zeus, and offered a pig there as a sacrifice. This is known as the Abomination of Desolation. And he would die a gruesome death just 3 years later. Just saying. By the time Antiochus had died, his successor agreed to the Jews' demand for independence. In the year 142 BC, after more than 500 years of subjugation, the Jews were again masters of their own fate for another 80 years. The Maccabees were a ruthless family from Judah that ruled for 85 years under the Hasmonean dynasty. Eventually, the Pharisees called on the Romans to save them from the Hasmoneans in 63 BC. But when the Romans arrived, General Pompey marched his army into the Holy of Holies, thereby desecrating it. Pompey died in 48 BC after being struck by lightning. I am starting to sense a theme here. Now the Holy of Holies was an inner sanctuary in the tabernacle. The high priest would enter this area once a year on the Day of Atonement to sprinkle blood of sacrificial animals, a bull offered as atonement for the priest and his household, and a goat offered as atonement for the people. So, that was a big deal. Now, I want to show you what was going on during Jesus' time on earth. The Jews had just lost their independence again, and the Roman era had just begun. This is important to note because of all the relics in the cities we visited, including Caesarea Maritime, are from the Roman era. Also note that Herod ruled during Jesus' time, and we'll see his handiwork coming up very soon, as well as Caesar Augustus. The Roman Empire lasted about 400 years. Several more dynasties rose and fell over the next 1600 years, leading up to the British Mandate in 1917. But Dave, I thought you said Israel had 3 periods of independence, and I only see 2 orange columns. You are correct. The State of Israel was established for the 3rd time in 1948. Well, I think we need a break after all that. Here's the view from our room at the Ramada in the city of Netanya, about 20 miles north of Tel Aviv. The Mediterranean Sea is where men first learned to sail the seas. 2,100 miles between Caesarea and the Straits of Gibraltar, which connects to the Atlantic Ocean between Africa and Europe. It was a massive trade route back in Jesus' time. And if you remember, all travel between Europe, Asia, and Africa had to go through Israel. We just learned that Israel had been under foreign occupation for the past 3,000 years, except for 3 very short periods of time. Why? All the empires of the world wanted to conquer this piece of land. Caesarea Maritime was the capital city of the province of Judea back in Jesus' time. Today, the modern city of Caesarea is one of the wealthiest cities in Israel. This is where the rich people and the who's who of politicians all hang out. There's evidence of city walls from the Crusader era too in Caesarea, which came after the Roman era by about 750 years. However, the Roman city walls were far more extensive. So we know that Jesus' time on earth was during the early Roman era. To understand the background of the New Testament, we need to understand that the Romans saw the Jews as barbarians, and they were determined to force their culture on them. The Jews rebelled against the Romans 3 times, and each time it ended in a disaster where the Romans destroyed their temple, enslaved their people, and scattered Jewish people all over the world. The Caesar in Jesus' time was Augustus Caesar. He was the most important Caesar of all. He ruled the Roman Empire for 57 years and created peace by massacring all nations around the Roman Empire. Jesus' message of hope, grace, mercy, and love took place in one of the most horrific eras in history. Herod the Great built Caesarea Maritime in honor of Caesar Augustus. Herod constructed the largest harbor on the east side of the Mediterranean Sea, and Caesarea became the gateway to the Roman Empire. And like all Roman cities, he built a theater for shows, an amphitheater, and a hippodrome for executions and propaganda, a cardo, think of that as cardio, as in the heart of the city. It was the main shopping street, a main square, public bathhouses, public latrines, aqueducts bringing in fresh water, and streets that run north and south. The theater today is only 20% of what it used to be. It seats 4,000 people, and back in Jesus' time, it sat 20,000. The entire upper structure is missing today. But check out this sketch of what it probably looked like back in the day. There's a lot of New Testament history in Caesarea. In Acts chapter 10, a man named Cornelius, a centurion in the Italian regiment, had a vision where an angel told him to send a team to Joppa and bring back a man named Simon Peter. The next day, Peter received a vision and was told by God that he could eat any animal on the planet, which Peter, a good Jew, rejected. He would never eat anything unclean. But God told him not to call impure anything that God has made clean. So, as Peter was waking up from the vision, the 3 men sent by Cornelius arrived, and it became apparent to Peter that God was telling him that Gentiles, like you and me, were included in God's family. That breakthrough happened right here, and, well, I'll let Pastor Ray tell you why.
mean, if you just sit here in just a moment and realize all that Iran has just said, that because of the Holy Spirit speaking through Cornelius, or through Peter to Cornelius, you sit here today. That you're included within the body of Christ because of what took place in this very area. That speaks to me a lot. That I'm here because of Peter and because of the preaching of Paul.
Thanks, Pastor Ray. Here's my thought. I think Jesus called Peter the Rock for more reasons than we're aware of. As Ray mentioned, we also know from the book of Acts, chapter 23, that the Apostle Paul spent a couple of not-so-good years in Caesarea. So awesome to think that we know that Paul was in this very vicinity. Very likely he could have been preaching at this very amphitheater. Awesome. You want to talk about a palace? Then let's talk about Herod the Great's palace. Here's what's left of it today, and even though the palace itself has been washed away, you can still see its foundation and the imprint of a freshwater swimming pool. Nice. Let's go back to that virtual view to check out the palace and see what that might have looked like. Pretty spectacular, right? His living quarters had an incredible view of the Mediterranean Sea, and that building around the swimming pool is at least 3 stories high. Here's a blueprint I picked up from one of Herod's scribes. Oh, that is sweet! I could kick back in that place. In this view, you can see the lower palace, or living quarters, up at the top, and you can see where the swimming pool was, and you can clearly see where the upper palace stood. Now remember, this building was jacked up 3, 4, 5 stories tall. It was immense, so what we're looking at is the ground floor or basement. A perfect place for Herod's Praetorium, or jail, where Paul was locked up for 2.5 years before heading off to Rome to appear before Caesar. Now just to add some intrigue, I think it's possible he could have been kept in this area, which looks to be under the main floor and right next to the hippodrome. You can see what looks like rooms under there. But as we heard several times on our tour, if it didn't happen here, meaning the exact spot, it happened here, meaning within this immediate area. So Paul didn't leave behind any graffiti to ID his exact cell, but we know Herod's Praetorium was located in his palace. All right, so I am standing in the middle of the amphitheater, and if you can imagine 4 chariots with 4 horses each going around this track and then trying to make that turn up there. There's a huge crash area to the outside, and which is a very bloody sport, if you can imagine. Actually, one of the primary reasons for this amphitheater is public execution. Many of the early Christians lost their lives in a place like this. The reason for building all these huge architectural feats was to impress upon these, in this case, Jewish barbarians, the need to conform and integrate them into the unity of the Roman Empire. You see, you as an individual are insignificant, and if you decided to step out of line, then you will be made an example of so that no one decides to follow in your footsteps. So, we'll build fun attractions where you can watch thrilling chariot races and the Olympic Games, but fall out of line and you could become the next main event in this very venue. As usual, we have left way too much undiscovered here, but we have bigger and better things on our agenda today, at least that's what they tell us, and we're on our way to Mount Carmel. The drive up is very scenic, and you may see an occasional ancient artifact along the way, like part of an aqueduct. Off to the right, you can see Mount Carmel. A monastery has been built on top of what used to be the old house of Baal, and from the roof of the monastery, you can see the road we're driving on. So keep that in mind for later. Now, I just said Baal, others say Baal, but from here on, I'm going to say Baal because I just think it sounds better. Arriving at Mount Carmel, we find a beautiful garden area next to the monastery and views that are difficult to describe at best. But if you don't know the significance of this place, then it's just another pretty view. So, as you listen to the next few minutes, imagine all of Israel camped out on the sides of Mount Carmel, watching and waiting for what's about to take place. Okay, so a quick history lesson is needed here, but let's call it an awesome story for those of you that don't like history. Once upon a time, Israel had an evil king named Ahab, and he had a wife, his queen, named Jezebel, that was even more evil than he. Oh, now you're interested, right? Well, remember, Israel and Judah were now two separate kingdoms. Jezebel convinced Ahab to further rebel from God and serve and worship Baal. Baal was the Canaanites' god of fertility, and the high priest of Baal would act out in certain rituals with temple prostitutes and public things you wouldn't normally do in public. Got that? Jezebel had been on a terror, aiming to kill all the prophets of the true God of Israel, Yahweh. Fortunately, Obadiah, Ahab's palace administrator, heard what was going on and hid 100 prophets of God in two separate caves, and Elijah was the only prophet left out in the open. 3 years earlier, Elijah prophesied to Ahab that Israel would go into a severe drought because of his unfaithfulness, which spurred on the whole Jezebel killing prophets craze. At the end of the 3-year drought, Elijah approached Ahab again and challenged the 450 prophets of Baal to a duel. So Ahab sent word all throughout Israel for the prophets to meet on Friday at high noon at the house of Baal on Mount Carmel. And Elijah appeared before all the people and said, "Whose side are you on, Baal or the Lord God?" And the people be like, so Elijah says, "Let's get 2 bulls, one for the prophets of Baal and one for me. And we'll cut it into pieces, we'll stack it on wood, but we're not going to set it on fire. And instead, you call out to your God, and I'll call out to my God, and whichever answers by fire, he is the true God." Now the people be like, game on. Now, I always thought this just played out between Elijah, the prophets of Baal, and a handful of other onlookers. But everyone knew that this was a showdown of showdowns. And if you weren't on Mount Carmel, your eyes were fixated on Mount Carmel. In reality, this started off in the morning, and it all takes place in 1 Kings chapter 18. Elijah gave the prophets of Baal the honor of going first, so they danced, and they shouted, they slashed themselves with swords, to no avail. Noon passed, and Elijah started taunting them. "Maybe he's sleeping, try yelling louder." This went on into the afternoon, but still no response. Finally, Elijah said, "It's my turn." And he dug a trench around the altar he built, and then asked for 12 buckets of water to be poured on top of the bowl pieces and wood. It was drenched, and the trench was full of water. Then Elijah prayed that God would answer his prayer and that his people would turn their hearts back to him again. And boom! The fire was so intense that it not only burned up the sacrifice, but also the stones for the altar, scorched the soil, and dried up all the water. Did you hear that? It consumed the stones. The Israelites threw themselves on the ground and proclaimed, "The Lord alone is God." The road we were on a few minutes ago is right here, and you better believe they saw it all take place. You see, God doesn't do anything halfway. It was spectacular, so that all would know who the true God is. Here's Pastor Ray again.
Let me tell you how you really know it's God. It's never done halfway. You just know. Because the Bible just said he didn't just consume the sacrifice, he consumed the altar, he consumed the water, he consumed the soil. Too oftentimes we look for God in all the wrong places. Trust me, when it's God, you're going to know it. God's going to speak. I mean, you look at this valley and we all want to jump ahead to the Battle of Armageddon. That's when the finality of things come into play. But between now and then, there's a whole lot of altars to be rebuilt. There's a whole lot of prayers to be offered.
This is the Brook of Keshawn, and you can see how close it is. Elijah ordered the people to seize the prophets of Baal, and he led them down to the Brook of Keshawn and killed all the prophets of Baal. Rain began to fall, and the drought ended later that afternoon. And that brings us up to speed on why we came here. Now we're off to Megiddo, but I want to show you what the Mediterranean forest looked like. It's not a forest of tall evergreen trees like the part of the country I live in, but when the Bible talks about forest, it's mostly oak trees, pistachio trees, and other broadleaf varieties. Megiddo, or its proper name, Tel Megiddo, is the first tell we'll be visiting on our tour. A tell is an archaeological mound or hill, and there are over 200 tells throughout Israel. Some have been excavated and many are still covered up. You can distinguish a tell by its form and location, usually on a hill and geometric shape. The Hill of Megiddo is Hebrew for Armageddon, and we're about to step foot on the Hill of Megiddo, a place where the first battle ever recorded took place between the Mongolians and the Egyptians, and the future site of the final battle. You may think Armageddon is mentioned many times in the Bible, but it's only mentioned once in Revelation 16:16 as the location where the kings of the earth under demonic leadership will wage war with the forces of God. At the end of this segment, I'm going to tell you exactly who, what, and when is going to take place in this exact location. No, I'm not. Megiddo is the cradle of Old Testament archaeology. It is the most excavated Old Testament site. To give you some perspective, Israel entered the Promised Land around 1250 BC, but the first cities were built here over 5,000 years ago. The Canaanites lived here before it was the Promised Land. The Canaanites were overthrown by the Philistines, who were overthrown by the Israelites under King David, and later the Assyrians would conquer Israel in 720 BC. Remember the timeline. During King Solomon's time, he built 3 governmental cities, Hazor, Gezer, and Megiddo, which are mentioned in 1 Kings 9:15. The city gate of Megiddo, named the Solomonic Gate, was discovered in 1937 and was attributed to King Solomon based on materials found that were used to build the gate as described in 1 Kings 7:12. However, in 1940, a dissenting view appeared that suggested the time period should be moved out to about 50 years after King Solomon's time. So what's the big deal about 50 years, right? Well, if you're trying to prove that the Bible is inaccurate, then moving the date out of King Solomon's timeline is huge. However, in 1958, identical city gates were found in Hazor and Gezer, the other 2 governmental cities built by King Solomon, which put this controversy to rest. Today, all archaeologists in Israel agree that these gates are from King Solomon's time, which is why the National Parks authorities have agreed to rebuild the gate, which is taking place right now. This area used to be the Temple of Baal at Megiddo. The round shape you see used to be the altar used by the Canaanites for animal sacrifices. A priest would climb up those stairs located on the east side of the altar and hold up the sacrificial animal towards the house of Baal in the north, located on Mount Carmel. Just imagine what was going through their minds when the fireball came down. Megiddo and the Jezreel Valley played host to a number of biblical battles, and several of those were over the ownership of Megiddo. But it's been discovered that somewhere between 28 and 32 different cultures have actually inhabited this city. Why? Well, check out the trade routes of the day. Megiddo was the intersection of military routes and trade routes from both water and land. It was prime real estate. This has also been the stage of world powers. General Allenby of the British Army fought the Battle of Megiddo versus the Turks as the first battle of World War I in 1918. Prior to that, Napoleon fought the British here in 1799 and claimed the Jezreel Valley as the perfect battlefield. There are numerous artifacts on site. Some of the items that stood out to me were a huge grain silo built in King Jeroboam II's time with a capacity of 450 cubic meters. They've also uncovered horse stalls, which reflect that chariots were being used. I mean, this whole place is one big artifact. Again, you can easily spend an entire day at this site. There is so much history that is played out in this valley, but the mountains have their own stories as well. Mount Gilboa is where Saul and his 3 sons died. Mount Tabor is thought to be the site of the transfiguration of Jesus, and the Gospels Matthew, Mark, and Luke record that event. And then there's something about a big oak tree on the hill of Moreh, and I haven't figured that one out, so if you've got inside knowledge, leave me a comment below. This is my final thought on Megiddo, or Armageddon. I could look out on this view all day long, just imagining what's going to take place, and part of me wishing I could be here to watch it all play out, but also knowing the horrific truth that's going to take place here. As we see what's taking place in our world, our politics, our culture, it seems like this event is steamrolling towards us. But here's the good news.
I read the end of the book, and he wins.
And that's all we need to know. As we head towards Nazareth, we are going right through the heart of the fertile Jezreel Valley, a land where the Israelites didn't have to worry about irrigation problems like they did in Egypt, but where God supplied water for their crops with abundant rain, and still does today. We're driving past Mount Moreh, and there is another story here besides something about an oak tree. It's the battle of Gideon and the Midianites. In chapter 7 of the Book of Judges, the Lord tells Gideon to select only 300 men to fight this fight, lest the Israelites would boast about their own strength. So God put fear in the hearts of the Midianites, who were camping all around the valley with their camels and tents. There were as many camels as there is sand on the seashore. Gideon and his men were on the other side of Mount Moreh when God told Gideon to split up his 300 men into 3 separate companies and attack at night, each man to have a trumpet and a torch. And the attack started with the sound of trumpets and raised torches. The Midianites thought they were being attacked by 300 legions, not 300 men. Now add to that, camels apparently have no night vision. So imagine camels as thick as sand going absolutely crazy. The Bible tells us that the Midianites killed more of their own people than Gideon's own small army of 300 did. If you're hoping to find where Jesus grew up in Nazareth, you'll probably be disappointed. In Jesus' time, this small village was home to no more than 24 families. It was so insignificant it was never mentioned in the Old Testament. Today, in this city of 55,000 people, archaeologists continue to explore this area for the exact location of his childhood home. But if you like, there is a recreated first century town with actors that portray what life was like in Jesus' time. We're actually on Mount Precipice, directly across from Nazareth. Now, when Jesus came back to Nazareth, they honored him by having him read from the prophets. So he opened up the scroll and read Isaiah 61, which talks about a great time in Israel's future. Joy instead of mourning, freedom for the captives, the restoration of Jerusalem, people receiving a double portion of their inheritance. Jesus tells them that today this has been fulfilled in front of your eyes. That is the best thing anyone could have told them. But then, Jesus tells them that their Messiah has come not only for the Jews, but for their enemies. They were enraged by this revelation, and they ran him out of the synagogue and brought him up this hill at Mount Precipice to force him off a cliff to kill him. But in Luke 4, the Bible says he simply disappeared within the crowd. This place is also known as the Mount of the Leap, where some folks believe Jesus leapt into thin air and disappeared. I can't find any translation that says that, but it sounds like a great story, right? This day has been one visual highlight after another, starting off with incredible views of the Mediterranean Sea at Caesarea Maritime and stunning views of the Jezreel Valley from Mount Carmel, Megiddo, and now Mount Precipice across from Nazareth. I can't think of a better way to end this video than by simply sharing more of these great views with you. Well, thanks for watching. That's it for this video. Next time, we'll be all around the Sea of Galilee and Capernaum, Magdala, maybe even the Jordan River. So if you like this, please subscribe to my channel. Give me a thumbs up down below, and we'll see you next time. Hi folks, my name is Dave and welcome to my series on Jordan and Israel. There's evidence of city walls from the Crusader era too in Caesarea. It's a lot of C's. This has also been Megiddo and the Jezreel Valley played host to a number of biblical battles. Number of biblical battles. Located on Mount Carmel. That's pretty good.